A lot of individuals will be focusing on mono elemental teams, such as mono quantum specifically, and mono imaginary, especially once the next banners arrive. If you're wondering which team arguably has more potential, I'd say it's mono imaginary, just simply due to the fact that we already have a great imaginary healer, we already have Wukong as a wonderful imaginary based buffer. Weltz is your Nihility slow character, which allows your character to take more action, and then you have Dan Feng, whose real name I am not going to attempt to pronounce, as your destruction imaginary damage dealer. Even if you were to hypothetically take someone out and slide in a Silverwolf for the sole purpose of adding in that weakness, it's still a great team composition, and arguably you could slot out Welt for Silverwolf. And yes, I understand, Mono Imaginary has Zeely, it has QQ as possible main damage healers, you have Silverwolf as your supports, and then you have Lynx as your brand new healer, and finally Fu Xuan as your preservation based character. The problem I see with this team composition is Fu Xuan as a preservation character may not be what a lot of people are expecting, or may not be as good as a lot of individuals are expecting, but I will hold my breath until she actually does release, and we do have the time to test her out. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, Imaginary is almost fully built and we're just waiting for one character. With Quantum, we're waiting on two. But I do understand that Mono Imaginary is arguably more expensive team composition just due to the value and rarity of a lot of those characters. But ignoring that, I want to discuss why Mono Elemental teams won't necessarily be something that I recommend a lot of individuals specifically pull for with the intention on building out. I understand that the vast majority of people who do want to run a mono elemental team are considering doing it for Silverwolf's purposes just because you can consistently add that weakness. And don't get me wrong, that weakness is great. However, I do think the downside of running a mono elemental team is that you're essentially binding a lot of great characters to one team composition, obviously. And secondarily, there's no real benefit. Sure, you hypothetically can break weaknesses more often, but outside of that, there's not much else. It's not like you get additional resonances or additional bonuses for having more characters of the same type in your team comp. In actuality, it may be more beneficial for you to run a different element for the sole purpose of breaking weaknesses, just for the point of getting more damage out of it. And even if we are hypothetically throwing in the best characters for each mono elemental team, that being Sealy, Silverwolf, Lynx, and then a preservation path Fu Xuan, your other teams don't necessarily have the ability to use any of those characters, which in Silverwolf's case may be really bad, and that team's damage may be lower compared to something else, because even though Sealy and Silverwolf are great characters, Lynx and Fu Xuan are not necessarily damage dealers in their own right, or buffers, and you're losing out on access to Ting Yun, Bronya, Wukong. These are great buffing characters who can really help your main damage dealer do a lot, especially Wukong and Bronya, as Sealy has the ability to essentially continue her turn on over and over and over again, making their buffs last an extremely long time. And so when you take that away from them for the sole purpose of running a mono elemental team, you need to question if the buffs you're getting are worth it. And because buffs for mono elemental teams don't necessarily have the best range, it don't necessarily eclipse that of a Bronya or a Wukong and Ting Yun, because not as though all your team regenerates energy because they're quantum, you end up, I'd say, in a bad position or a worse off position, because sure, the novelty of a quantum based team or the novelty of an imaginary team may be great in that moment, but long term I do think it pales in comparison, because you are losing out on some of the better buffers. And if hypothetically you take in a Sealy, slot in a Bronya, slot in a Silverwolf, or if you don't necessarily need that weakness break, you slide in a healer and then go for a shielder or a Pela, you're not necessarily running a mono elemental team in the slightest, but you do have more damage because you're shredding resistances with Pela, you're getting a buff with Bronya and instant turn actions, and your healer is whoever you want them to be. You're not restricted to leveling up one character type. And so I think mono elemental teams are nice to have. I think they're great in addition to the current roster we do have, but as of right now, the roster isn't big enough for me to say, yeah, this is something you really should summon for. I think that Genshin introduced mono elemental teams, I believe a year or two after. I think Ito is the primary mono elemental team, and that was really it, and he had a specialized support for him, that being Goro, because Albedo and Zhongli were introduced about a year earlier. But ignoring that, Genshin was built primarily upon reactions, and so when you have a mono elemental team, it meant that you had to have enough damage to ignore the concept of reactions existing. And even then, we haven't really gotten much support from mono elemental teams until I believe Lenny right now. And so if I'm looking at Honkai Star Rail and I'm looking at the current roster, we have a great amount of elements, we have a great amount of characters, and the closest mono elemental team right now we have is Yanqing, Pela with a Gepard, and I believe in March 7th, if you want to slide someone in there like that, you can do it a Silverwolf. You can slide in a Yukong or a Tingyun, whoever wants to take up that third slot. But that mono ice team is actually pretty good, but that's pretty good because Jopar needs to be paired with Yanqing anyway. Pela is just great as a unit overall, and Silverwolf or whoever you slide into that third position is quite nice regardless. And so your team isn't necessarily nice because it's mono elemental team, but it's nice because it's just good characters. And I think that's what I recommend people prioritize first and foremost. If you have a Luocha, if you have a Bailu, a Natasha already built up, you don't need Lynx. Lynx is a good healer. Lynx can be better than Natasha, but is the improvement in Natasha's healing or the improvement in healing in general worth you risking getting a 5-star you might not use on that banner? I personally don't think so, but if you're pulling on that banner anyway for the 4 stars like a Pela, like a March 7th, like a Lynx, it's great regardless. And if you do have the characters already built up for Mono Quantum, cool, nice pickup. But I don't think pulling on any banner specifically for the purposes of filling out one niche team comp is worthwhile. If you're looking at Fu Xuan and you like her kit and you like her design and you like her character, that is entirely different from pulling for her just for the purposes of hoping her kit works well with the other characters you have. Because it might not, and if it doesn't, you've wasted your Primo Gems or your gems on a character you legitimately won't use, save for very rare case scenarios. I personally will be going for Fu Xuan, not necessarily because I legitimately need her, but because I have to for the content. I have a Kafka just for that sole purpose as well, even though I hate her as a character. And so I do have the team requirements for a mono quantum team, and I do want to test this out, but ultimately I don't think it's worth it, especially if you're free to play, to pull for a character for the purposes of them fitting, hopefully, in one team comp. That's just my opinion though. I want to hear yours as well. Either way though, I do think Honkai Starva is in a good position. I do think if you're looking at rosters, the banners aren't too bad. Asta is an individual who is E2 or E1 to E6, because E4 and E6 do work really well together. Pela, all her Eidolons are good. I'd say E1 is great, E6 and everything else just improved for damage and capabilities. I'd say E1 is the primary one you want to go for. March 7th, all of them are quite nice. I don't think any of them are game breaking or dramatically improve her character. I just think they're nice to have. Lynx, go for her regardless because she's a healer and a 4-star, and we don't have much in the way of that other than Natasha. Yukong, she's a very much E1 is nice. E2 and everything else beyond that is decent enough, but E2, 3, and 4 are essentially all just improving her damages. 3 and 5 are just ultimate and skill improvements, which is quite nice, and then 4 and 6 are meant to be paired together. So she gets much more value out of that regardless. So I'd say that if you're looking at this banner, Lynx is arguably the most valuable thing on it outside of the characters, and I just say that because healers are pretty important. But if none of these characters interest you, hey, skip out. You don't need them right now. And Lynx is a 4-star. She could always come around and spook you on standard or on another banner. So do not build pity, do not wish if you don't want the character, and objectively, just hold off because it's always better to have a full information going into a banner than pulling on the first day of a banner and hoping you can figure it out later on. We'll see if mono elemental teams are worthwhile to run. As of right now though, I don't see anything special about them unless you add in weaknesses, and if you do, that's not really a mono elemental team because it's just focusing on Silverwolf and cleaving or having the weakness break debuff on your enemy. And Imaginary has a nice slowing weakness break, and Quantum has Entanglement, which stops turns but does deal a lot of damage at the end of it. But you don't need a mono elemental team to do that, you just need a character or two, or a break effect to Silverwolf. But either way, I understand a lot of individuals are excited for Fu Xuan regardless. I think she's quite cute, I like her design, I just don't know if I'm going to like her kit, but we'll see when that comes out, alongside the new events and the free 10-4 they're giving out. Regardless, if you enjoyed this, leave a like down below, consider subscribing to the channel, and I do hope to see you next time. I hope that if you're running and going for either one of these banners, you have good luck. I hope if you do decide to build out one of these, you're building that because you legitimately want to enjoy their kit and not because you just want to run one niche team composition, because I don't think that's worth it. I honestly don't, and I think a lot of Quantum characters are really good enough to the extent to where we don't want to just limit them to one team. But hey, that's just my opinion. I understand yours can differ. Tell me down below, and I'll see you next time.